The Collins farm sat on the edge of the prairie, far enough from town that the quiet around it felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The land was not poor, the crops were not thin, yet something about it drew silence from those who passed. They would ride quickly down the dirt road, their eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to look too long at the 24 wooden crosses planted in neat rows behind the weather-beaten barn. The crosses bore no names, only crude carvings of dates, some spaced days apart, others mere hours. To strangers, they marked the tragedies of a large family struck down by illness, but to the neighbors who lived close enough to hear faint sounds in the night, those graves were a riddle, one they prayed would never be solved. At first, pity covered the Collins family like a shroud. People whispered that fever must have taken the children. It was the year when disease swept through Illinois, and it seemed possible. Yet doubts soon grew heavier than sympathy. Families stricken by fever left behind screams, chaos, and desperate pleas for doctors. But no one recalled hearing that from the Collins household. Instead, there were quiet nights broken by muffled cries, sudden cut-offs, and strange smells carried on the wind. A burning sweetness mixed with rot, drifting from the farmyard like smoke from a hidden pyre. The neighbors told themselves it was only sickness, but when more crosses appeared, even pity became hollow. What unsettled people most was the neatness. The graves were too straight, too exact, as if planned with a carpenter's precision. No farmer, crushed by grief, would place his children in the earth with such cold geometry. They would stumble, they would break, they would weep into the dirt. But the Collins graves looked like a soldier's yard, ordered in uniform, every wooden cross shaped by the same careful hands. To some it seemed more like a display than a burial ground. Thomas Collins was seen each Sunday in church, his head bowed, his voice soft, his frame thin and humble. He spoke little, and when he did, his words came measured, never careless. He offered baskets of apples to widows and coin to passing beggars, as though to remind others that kindness still lived within him. But beneath that thin smile was a gaze that held too long on faces, as if studying them, as if weighing how much suffering each might hold. The neighbors said he loved his family, but they had never once seen him weep at the graves. Not a single tear, not a single collapse of strength. He stood over them the way one oversees a task completed, his hands folded as if the matter were resolved. Children whispered that the Collins graves were empty. They dared one another to touch the crosses on moonlit nights, but none ever did. Dogs refused to linger near the barn, pulling hard at their leashes, whining until they were dragged away. Men who tilled their fields near the Collins property swore they heard knocks echoing from the earth, as though someone below was trying to signal too weak to rise. But when asked again, they shook their heads and laughed nervously, unwilling to say such things aloud in daylight. The graves remained, silent and waiting. 24 markers with nothing beneath but damp soil, and still, more appeared. Each new cross drove the neighbors deeper into unease, but not one of them dared challenge Thomas Collins. They told themselves that sometimes death comes quick, sometimes fate is cruel, and sometimes families carry curses. They did not speak of the truth that haunted their own thoughts, that a man could create tragedy not from misfortune, but from choice. And so the Collins farm remained untouched, a place where death walked quietly, where wooden crosses held no names, and where the ground itself seemed to warn anyone who drew too close. It would take a storm to unearth the secrets hidden beneath that soil, and until then the graves stood as a silent promise that something far worse than illness lived within those fields. Thomas Collins lived in the town's memory as a gentle figure, a man whose clothes were always pressed, whose boots were never muddied more than a day, whose hat tipped low in a gesture of respect whenever he passed. He sat in the church pew each Sunday with his hands folded, his face calm and expressionless, like a man who had mastered his grief. When the hymns were sung, his lips moved without sound, as though the act itself was more important than the prayer it carried. To the townsfolk, he seemed a father broken by loss but lifted by faith, a man who had not surrendered to bitterness. They whispered that perhaps God had chosen him for heavier burdens and that his quiet acceptance was something holy. But the surface they admired was a mask, a skin stretched tight over a mind that was studying, cataloging, and waiting. Years later, when the sheriff broke open the cellar door and discovered the notebooks, they realized that Collins had not been mourning his family. He had been measuring them. The journals were filled with sharp, neat lines of script, every word pressed into the page with precision. He recorded how long a body could go without water before voice failed. He wrote how fever rose faster if the windows were sealed shut and the air grew stale, how hunger twisted the face of a child into a permanent scream after 12 days. Each entry was written not with the grief of a father, but with the clarity of a scientist. He had written of his own sons not as boys, but as subjects. Their names did not appear in the pages. They were numbered, reduced to figures in a larger experiment. The people of the town remembered how generous he had seemed. He gave small coins to widows, repaired fences for neighbors, and carried firewood to old men too frail to lift it themselves. But every act of kindness was its own kind of disguise, each gesture meant to deepen his cover. The same hands that offered bread were the hands that measured how long a child's heart could keep beating after being forced to kneel in freezing water through the night. He was not a farmer at all, not in his truest self. The crops were only an excuse for isolation. What he cultivated was suffering. What he harvested was silence. In his journals, he wrote of silence as if it were a substance, something to be gathered, tested, and stored. He wrote that silence has weight, that the final breath of the dying carried a stillness thicker than stone. He claimed he could feel it pressing against the walls of the house, building in corners, seeping through the boards. He believed that if he gathered enough, he could shape it, bend it, even feed it back into the living to see how it warped them. To him, faith was not about salvation, but about endurance. He saw pain as proof of the soul's existence, a kind of cruel sacrament that only he could administer. The townsfolk noticed how often he lingered over children during church gatherings, how he would smile softly as if charmed by their innocence. Mothers thought it touching, a father who had lost so much still able to love the laughter of others. But in his writings he confessed that he saw children differently. He wrote that their small lungs carried shorter silences, that their thin bodies held fewer echoes, and that they broke quickly like dry twigs beneath a boot. Yet he marveled at the way their fear spread through a household, how one child's scream could hollow out a mother, how a father's begging turned to collapse after hearing his child's voice go quiet. For Collins, it was never about the act alone. It was about the ripples of destruction, how one methodical death infected the minds of everyone tied to it. He believed he was chosen to measure these things, and the mask of faith was his shield. He sat in the church pews and listened to sermons of redemption, but in his heart he was composing his own scripture, one where blood replaced wine, where silence replaced song, and where endurance through pain was the only proof of the soul. The neighbors saw only the hollow smile of a grieving man. They could not know that behind that smile was a ledger of cruelty, a book that grew heavier each day, as carefully tended as any farm ledger, where each life taken was not mourned but tallied. And so the town carried on, comforted by his apparent goodness, while the farm behind him grew darker, its quiet graves multiplying. Thomas Collins walked among them each Sunday, untouched by suspicion, his mask unbroken, his mind turning endlessly to new ways of shaping silence from flesh. Inside the farmhouse, the Collins family lived in a world that did not follow the rhythms of the town. Curtains were drawn even in daylight, and the air smelled of boiled lye, vinegar, and burning resin. The neighbors who came near enough to catch the scent told themselves it was only soap-making, a common enough practice in rural Illinois. But what seeped out of those walls was not the smell of cleanliness. It was the smoke of experiments, where Thomas Collins turned his own home into a laboratory of pain. The first to suffer were his children. They were small, fragile things, still clinging to the warmth of their mother when Collins began his trials. He treated them not as sons and daughters, but as instruments. In his journals, he wrote of roots planted in flesh, and he stitched strips of their skin against wooden boards, pressing them flat with nails as if to see whether flesh could take on the grain of timber if starved of freedom. He recorded how long it took for the wounds to rot, how the body reacted when pain was stretched past what nature intended. To the outside world, those children simply vanished, marked down by neighbors as lost to fever. But their cries at night were not the cries of sickness. They were the sounds of bodies being broken to fit a father's obsession. Collins believed that darkness was its own harvest. He sealed the windows of the upstairs rooms, keeping his children inside for weeks with no light, feeding them only enough to keep them alive. He wrote that madness bloomed like corn when starved of the sun. He studied the whispers they spoke to themselves in the dark, how their voices grew softer until even in daylight they no longer looked to the window but only to the floor. He charted how long it took for them to claw at their own skin as though their bodies were trying to crawl away from their minds. When death finally came, he noted it not as tragedy but as conclusion. Their mother endured her own experiments, though her name was never written in the journals. He starved her of sleep, waking her with sudden strikes of cold water in the night, forcing her to remain on her knees for hours until her joints swelled. He wrote of how faith broke down in stages. First prayers were said louder, then softer, then finally not at all. When her body collapsed, he lifted her again, documenting how much longer she could endure after each fall. The neighbors remembered her only as pale, quiet, and distant in the last days they saw her, standing behind him in church with eyes that seemed not to focus on anything in the room. They never knew she was already an empty vessel, stripped of will by the man they thought was her protector. Collins was not careless. Every sound was calculated, every cry measured. He kept buckets of chemicals in the barn, mixing acids that ate through flesh, spreading them in small doses across wounds to see how long a body could fight decay while still alive. He believed the human form was not fixed but malleable, like clay. If pain could shape it, then perhaps silence itself could be bred into the blood. He looked at his family not as people to love, but as a field of trials, each one proving that endurance could be stretched, bent, and catalogued. What haunted the walls of the farmhouse was not only the suffering, but the order of it. The deaths did not come in chaos as disease or accident would. They came in sequence, each child removed from life after their usefulness ended, each burial timed with precision. The wooden crosses outside marked not just loss, but completion. It was as if Collins believed that every death was another page in his private scripture, a text only he could read. The town did not ask questions. When the Collins children were said to have passed from fever, the neighbors brought bread and whispered condolences, never pressing too closely, never challenging the calmness in Thomas Collins's face. No one saw the boards upstairs, stained with blood and skin. No one smelled the acrid stench of acid baths where bones had been softened to pulp. They accepted the story of illness because the truth, that a father could use his own household as a crucible of torture, was too heavy for their minds to hold. And so the farm carried on, quiet but restless, with smoke rising from its chimneys and rows of crosses standing behind the barn. Thomas Collins continued his work, his mask intact, his faith admired, while the cries that once filled the house grew fewer, until silence itself was the only sound that remained. To him, silence was not the end of life. It was the proof that his work was succeeding. When the Collins household grew too quiet to satisfy him, Thomas turned his eyes outward. The farm sat along a road traveled by drifters and salesmen, men seeking work or food, their lives already forgotten by the townsfolk who saw them only as shadows moving from one place to another. Collins recognized them not as burdens but as opportunities. He offered them meals in exchange for a bit of labor, his voice calm and kind, his table heavy with bread and stew. To the hungry, his generosity seemed like salvation. He spoke of faith, of duty, of how he understood the loneliness of men with no family. He told them they were welcome to stay the night, to rest in his barn where the hay was warm and the roof was dry. But once they stepped inside, the locks fell into place. The barn had been rebuilt in secret. Where animals should have been, Collins had built chambers of wood and iron, narrow boxes with holes for air, and hidden compartments where he kept his tools. He recorded each arrival in his journals, marking the men not by name but by description. The lame man with a red scarf, the merchant with a cracked tooth, the youth who sang while working. He did not see them as people but as variables. Each one was meant to prove or disprove a theory he had carried in his mind. The first tests were crude. He sealed the men into their chambers for days, feeding them sparingly through slits, listening to their voices grow weaker. He wrote that isolation stripped the mind faster than hunger, that the silence of a box was louder than any scream. But soon he sought sharper experiments. He cut away tongues, not for cruelty alone, but to measure how silence behaved when forced. He wrote that the removal of a tongue did not only stop a voice but broke the will, that men became shadows once robbed of speech. He kept the tongues in jars of salt water, labeling them with numbers, watching how long the flesh resisted decay. Later came the eyes. He sewed them shut with coarse thread, pulling lids together until no light could enter. He said he wished to study darkness, to see if the mind could invent its own sun when denied the real one. He described how men clawed at their faces, tearing their own skin to rid themselves of the stitch, how they begged for light though no sound carried through their toothless mouths. He measured how long it took before they stopped moving at all. Some lingered for weeks, rocking in their corners. Others collapsed quickly, their bodies surrendering before their minds. Each was recorded, each death filed neatly like a farmer counting his harvest. The townsfolk noticed the drifters less and less. They were men who came and went, and their absence was easily explained by the road itself. Yet strange details began to trouble a few. A merchant's horse was found tied near the Collins fence, reins cut, the rider never seen again. A young worker was last spotted carrying tools toward the farm, his family later asking where he had gone. Collins answered softly, saying the man had moved on west, seeking better work. His words were believed, for he spoke them with the calm of someone who could not imagine deceit. Inside the barn, the chambers filled and emptied. Each man who entered carried his own story, but Collins reduced them all to silence and shadow. He believed that each stripped voice added to the weight of quiet in the house, that each blinded man contributed to the darkness that pooled in his cellar. He was not only collecting bodies, he was shaping a kind of invisible harvest, convinced that silence itself could be stored like grain. His journals grew thicker, his experiments more exact, and yet to the town he remained the same gentle figure, attending church, bowing his head, smiling faintly at children. The guests never left, not in the way they expected. They became entries in his ledger, bones beneath his floor, whispers that no one else could hear. The farm carried their absence like a secret, and the wooden crosses behind the barn multiplied, neat and silent, while the road outside remained busy with the next travelers who would soon be welcomed inside. Beneath the Collins farmhouse lay a secret that no neighbor dared imagine. Behind a false wall in the cellar, concealed by stacked barrels and sacks of seed, a narrow passage led into the earth. The air grew colder there, and the smell was not of damp soil, but of iron, resin, and something sweet that lingered too long. Collins had carved a chamber into the ground with the patience of years, shaping it not as a root cellar or storage room, but as a chapel. Yet this chapel bore no crosses of Christ, no light from stained glass. Its walls were covered in pale fragments of bone, arranged in patterns like scripture written in marrow. Ribs bent into arches, spines stacked into columns, skulls placed like ornaments to watch whoever entered. He called it a holy place in his journals, though holiness had nothing to do with it. He believed the land itself had grown foul with sin, poisoned by men's lies and women's weakness, and that only blood could cleanse it. He drained that blood with patience, tying victims to iron frames and slicing veins with small incisions, so that life bled out not in minutes but in hours. The liquid was caught in jars, each sealed and lined neatly upon an altar of stone. He wrote that blood was the truest sacrament, thicker than wine, carrying the silence of death within it. Each jar was labeled, each marked with the time it had taken for the heart to stop. On the altar, preserved skins stretched taut across wooden boards. They were tanned like leather, treated with salt and resin until they no longer rotted. Collins had etched them with crude shapes and words, twisting scripture into symbols of his own making. He knelt before them as though they were sacred texts, reciting verses from his journals, not from the Bible. His faith had become something unrecognizable, a new religion where suffering was prayer and silence was proof. The tortures staged in that chapel were not only acts of cruelty but ceremonies. He forced victims to kneel upon sharpened stones, their bodies collapsing under weight, while he spoke calmly of cleansing the earth. He cut them with deliberate rhythm, one wound after another, waiting for screams to die into whimpers. He believed the moment of surrender, when the human voice went quiet, was a revelation, a window into the purity of silence he sought to collect. When the end finally came, he lifted the jar of blood as if it were a chalice, raising it to the hollow light of the lantern before sealing it away. Collins did not kill quickly, for quickness left nothing to study. He used fire in small ways, heating iron rods to press against flesh, not to burn it away, but to release the smell of living skin in the air. He placed bowls of lye beneath captives, forcing them to inhale the fumes until their throats closed and their lungs fought for air, only to revive them with water so the cycle could repeat. He treated each experiment like a verse, one step closer to proving that endurance itself was the root of salvation. To him, pain was not destruction but creation, shaping silence, shaping faith, shaping proof that the soul could be bent. The jars of blood lined the walls in neat rows, glowing dark in the lamplight. He would sit for hours before them, unmoving as though in prayer. To any who might have seen him there, it would have looked like devotion. His lips moved, though no sound came, his eyes fixed upon the glass vessels. He believed the jars whispered back, each one carrying the silence of a life taken, each one a testament to his twisted sacrament. Above ground, the Collins farm remained quiet, its fields neat, its fences mended. Neighbors saw only a man tending his land, a man who bowed his head in church. They did not know that beneath their very feet lay a chapel of bones and skins, a place where communion was not wine but blood, where prayer was not spoken but carved into flesh. They did not know that each new grave behind the barn marked not the loss of life to illness, but the offering of silence to a man who believed he was purifying the land with death. And still, the chapel waited in darkness, its walls watching, its jars filling, its altar stained with the proof of his faith. By the time his cellar was filled with jars of darkened blood and his barn held the stains of silence, Thomas Collins no longer thought of his acts as mere experiments. They had become ritual, a rhythm as steady as planting or harvest. He began to shape each death into a symbol, a kind of sermon where flesh and bone replaced scripture. His journals from this period read not like the notes of a man, but the liturgy of a priest presiding over a congregation of captives, every line mixing science with worship, cruelty with reverence. The first of these symbolic killings was a drifter taken from the road, a man strong from years of labor, his hands calloused and his back bent. Collins prepared a vat of lye in the cellar, a caustic mixture once used by farmers to make soap. But where others saw cleanliness, Collins saw transformation. He wrote that lye reduced flesh to its simplest truth, that it dissolved the lies of the body and left behind only residue, a pure white substance that could be shaped again. He bound the man's arms and lowered him slowly into the boiling liquid, documenting the screams, noting the time it took for skin to peel away, for bones to loosen and sink. He described with precision how the body became a pale mass, how the smell filled the cellar until it clung to the very boards. When the process was complete, he collected the soap-like residue and pressed it into blocks, stacking them neatly as though they were offerings. He wrote that they were new stone, unmarked by sin, proof that flesh could be cleansed through fire and lye. His next victim was a young woman, her life already marked by hardship, her hands raw from fieldwork. Collins wrapped her in sacks meant for wheat, binding her tightly until her arms and legs could not move. He placed her in a pit dug into the floor of his barn, and with careful patience he poured seed grain over her until her body was buried, her cries muffled beneath the shifting weight. He wrote that the earth must be fed with spirit as well as seed, that only then could the land yield purity. For hours he stood over the pit, listening as her muffled voice grew weaker, until silence alone remained. He covered the grain with soil, marking the spot with a crude wooden stake. To him, she had become fertilizer for the spirit, her death a sowing that would reap silence in seasons to come. He returned to that pit often, touching the soil as though feeling for signs of growth, convinced that silence itself was sprouting beneath. The most grotesque of his symbols came with an old soldier, a man who had wandered through Illinois after the war, carrying only memories of battle. Collins saw in him not a life, but a resource. He bled the man slowly in the chapel, collecting the blood as he had done with others, but it was the bones he sought most. When death came, he stripped the body with methodical precision, carving the larger bones into crude flutes. He hollowed them, polished them, and placed them upon his altar. At night he lifted them to his lips, blowing breath through them until faint ghostly sounds filled the chamber. He wrote that the music was prayer, that the dead now spoke through their own remains, joining his faith in silence. The neighbors might have heard faint tones carried on the wind at night, but they dismissed them as whistling through the trees. Only in the journals did the truth remain, that Collins believed he had created instruments of devotion, voices shaped from bone to honor the silence he worshipped. Each death followed the next with the same order a farmer brings to his crops. He planned them, prepared them, and recorded them with precision. He was not careless, never rushing. To him, cruelty was not madness, but duty. He shaped each victim into a parable, each body into a symbol that taught him something new. He wrote that boiling revealed purity, that burial revealed surrender, that music carved from bone revealed the persistence of silence even after death. And yet, in these acts, there was no chaos, no wild frenzy. There was only calm calculation. He remained the same quiet man at church, the same humble figure in town. But in his cellar and barn he was a priest, a scientist, and a farmer of silence all at once. His victims were not individuals to him, not people with names or pasts. They were sermons waiting to be spoken, harvests waiting to be gathered, instruments waiting to be tuned. The graves multiplied behind the barn, each cross neat and exact, each one marking not tragedy but ritual completion. And still the neighbors said nothing, too fearful of the silence that seemed to pool around the farm, too willing to believe the lies of sickness and fate. They did not see the soap stacked in his cellar, the grain pit that held the silence of a woman, or the flutes carved from a soldier's bones. They saw only Thomas Collins, the farmer with the hollow smile, bowing his head in church while his true congregation lay beneath his fields. By 1877, the quiet around the Collins farm had grown heavy enough that even the state could not ignore it. Taxes were owed, records demanded, and so a collector was sent from Springfield, a man trained to note details, to observe what farmers tried to hide. He arrived on horseback one clear morning wearing a pressed coat and carrying a ledger bound in leather. Neighbors saw him ride toward the Collins farm but never saw him return. Collins welcomed him with the same calmness he offered all his guests. He served coffee at the kitchen table, asked polite questions about the man's journey, and listened as the collector explained his task. All the while, Collins studied him, his stiff posture, his neat handwriting, the way his voice betrayed a pride in duty. Collins despised that pride. He believed it masked weakness, and weakness was what he wished to uncover. That night, while the collector slept in a spare bed upstairs, Collins locked the door and waited. The man awoke to smoke filling the room, not the smoke of fire, but of resin burning in a pan beneath the bed. He coughed, his eyes watering, his throat closing. By the time Collins entered, calm and deliberate, the man was half-conscious, his voice broken. Collins bound him in silence, carried him to the cellar, and began his study. The journals would later show neat entries, how long the throat resisted resin, how fear lingered in the eyes when oxygen thinned, how quickly dignity dissolved when breath was rationed. By dawn, the ledger the collector had brought was hidden beneath a floorboard, his body never seen again. Not long after, a traveling reverend passed through, a man whose sermons echoed fire and judgment. He was known for his booming voice, his certainty in naming sin where he saw it. He had been told by townsfolk that the Collins farm was marked by too much tragedy, that the graves behind the barn seemed unnatural. He rode toward the farmhouse with the boldness of one convinced that faith could not be deceived. But faith meant nothing inside Collins's chapel. Collins welcomed him warmly, praised his sermons, and listened as the Reverend spoke of God's mercy. But as night fell, Collins led him below, claiming to show him a space for prayer. The lantern revealed walls of bone and jars of blood, an altar of skin stretched across wood. The Reverend's voice broke into trembling gasps, his words caught between rage and horror. Collins wrote that the man's booming faith collapsed into a stutter when faced with proof of silence itself. He gagged him with cloth soaked in resin, tied his hands with rope stiffened by blood, and forced him to his knees upon the stone floor of the chapel. The night became an unholy liturgy, Collins chanting verses from his journals while the Reverend struggled, then weakened, then stilled. At dawn, his horse was found wandering near the fence line, reins stained with something darker than mud. The townsfolk began to whisper louder. 2 men gone, one with the authority of the state, the other with the authority of the church. Eyes turned toward the Collins farm, suspicion circling like vultures. Yet Collins's mask did not break. He visited church that Sunday, his face pale, his hands folded in prayer. When asked about the missing men, he spoke softly, suggesting they must have fallen victim to robbers along the road or wandered off to another county. His words were calm, measured and filled with the grief of one who had seen too much loss himself. And the town, desperate to protect its fragile peace, allowed itself to believe him. Beneath their belief, the graves behind the barn grew in number, each cross neat and silent, while in the cellar the altar gleamed with fresh jars of blood. The visitors had seen too much, and their voices had been folded into Collins's scripture of silence. The town, too afraid to look deeper, turned its eyes away, allowing the man with the hollow smile to keep his mask intact a little longer. The storm came in late autumn, black clouds rolling across the prairie, carrying winds that ripped fences from the ground and tore branches from trees. Rain fell in sheets, pounding the earth until the soil bled mud and the Collins farm sank into a swamp of its own making. Lightning struck the old oak near the barn, splitting it in half, and with the thunder came something no man expected. The graves behind the barn, those 24 wooden crosses lined in neat order, began to slide and cave beneath the weight of the water. By morning, the earth had opened like a wound. What lay beneath the crosses was not the stillness of bodies, but empty boxes half flooded with rain. The coffins were there, their lids cracked open, but inside was nothing but darkness. Neighbors found the site after the storm cleared, walking the property in secret, their boots sinking in the muck. They had long suspected sickness did not explain the Collins graves, but none had dared look closer until nature itself forced their eyes open. Panic spread like fire among them, whispers carrying from one household to the next. If no bodies lay beneath those crosses, then what had Collins been burying all these years? Why had the earth been disturbed so carefully, so often, if it held nothing at all? Fear sharpened their courage, and before night fell, a group of men gathered with lanterns, their voices hushed, their resolve brittle but unyielding. They returned to the farm not to pray or to comfort, but to dig. The barn was searched first. Tools were overturned, hay scattered, but what they found was more chilling than anything expected. Beneath the floorboards lay narrow chambers, their walls scratched with fingernails worn down to blood. Shackles hung from beams, still stained. The men said nothing at first, staring at one another, their silence thicker than the air. One lifted a lantern toward the house, and without words, they moved together, their boots heavy against the wooden porch. Inside the farmhouse, they found the hidden door. Barrels had been pushed aside by the storm's violence, revealing a seam in the cellar wall that none had noticed before. The boards were pried loose, and behind them stretched a tunnel, narrow and cold, carrying the stench of something long rotted. The men entered, their lantern light trembling on the damp walls until the tunnel opened into the chapel below. What they saw stripped them of speech. Bones lined the walls, arranged not in piles but in patterns, ribs bent into arches, skulls placed like ornaments. Jars of blood glimmered in the lantern light, stacked upon shelves as though they were harvest preserves. At the center stood an altar of stone, covered with skins stretched taut like parchment, etched with symbols carved in a hand both steady and obsessed. Beside it lay Collins's journals, page after page filled with neat writing, each line describing suffering as if it were scripture. Notes on silence, on the time it took for breath to fail, on the ways screams broke into whimpers, all recorded with precision as though human agony were something to be measured like rainfall. The men stood frozen, their eyes wide, their hands shaking around the lanterns. Some whispered prayers, others gagged from the stench, but none could deny what lay before them. This was no sickness, no fever, no curse of misfortune. This was the work of a man who had shaped death into ritual, who had built a chapel not to God but to silence itself. The graves outside had been nothing but markers, a performance to keep suspicion at bay. The true harvest lay here in bones and blood, in journals that spoke more clearly than any sermon. They left in silence, carrying with them the weight of what they had uncovered. knowing the town would never be the same. And yet Collins himself was nowhere to be found. His hollow smile already vanished into the night, leaving only his chapel as proof of the evil that had walked among them unseen. The discovery of the chapel spread through the town like sickness, whispered from one house to another until every hearth felt its shadow. Men who had peered into the cellar could not eat, their stomachs recoiling from memory. Women clutched their children closer, though none could explain why, only that something in the air had changed forever. The sheriff was summoned, riders sent to neighboring counties, the state promised an inquiry. But before authority arrived with its pens and seals and men in uniforms, Thomas Collins was already gone. His disappearance was not marked by panic or chase. It was quiet, deliberate, as though he had prepared for the moment long before. Some swore they saw him at dusk, walking along the riverbank, his coat buttoned neat, his hat in hand, moving with a calmness that belonged not to a man fleeing justice, but to a man finishing a task. There were stories that he carried weights, stones bound with rope, and that he stepped into the Illinois River without hesitation, vanishing beneath its black water as if surrendering himself to the silence he worshipped. Others doubted this, believing instead that he slipped westward under another name, disappearing into the sprawl of a nation too vast to remember one farmer from Illinois. In truth, no body was ever recovered, no grave ever filled. The town buried empty coffins once again, but this time their silence was different. Before, they had mourned what they thought were children lost to fever, lives cut short by chance. Now they mourned their own blindness, their own willingness to believe in the mask Collins had worn so well. The graves filled with nothing but earth and shame. Wooden crosses planted more for the living than the dead. Each one was a confession that they had been deceived by a man who looked like any other father. Collins's journals remained, page after page of his obsession, but reading them only deepened the wound. Every word was written with precision, every experiment recorded as though it were fact. The people who pored over those pages saw their own neighbors described not as names but as specimens, their suffering reduced to measurements of breath and silence. It was not only the cruelty that haunted them, but the methodical calmness with which it was carried out. This was not madness in the wild sense, not frenzy or drunken rage. It was patience, devotion, a belief carried out with the steadiness of prayer. The psychological toll weighed heavy. Families who had lost travelers to the road now suspected Collins had taken them, their grief poisoned with new clarity. Children who had whispered of strange cries from the farm now grew silent, their fears confirmed but too heavy to speak aloud. Even the sheriff, hardened by years of duty, admitted that he could not sleep, that every knock at his door felt like another victim clawing from beneath the ground. The town itself seemed altered, its air thick with guilt. Every smile was doubted, every act of kindness second-guessed. If Thomas Collins, the quiet father, the church-going farmer, had hidden such darkness, then who else might? Some searched for his body, dragging the river, probing its banks, but nothing surfaced. Others swore they saw him on distant roads, a man with familiar eyes and a stranger's name, moving from town to town like a shadow too cunning to catch. The uncertainty left no closure, only a wound that refused to heal. Collins became less a man than a story, a presence that lingered in absence, his vanishing more terrifying than his capture would have been. And so the farm was left behind, its barn hollow, its fields untended, its chapel sealed by boards and nails. Yet the silence remained, pressing upon the town like a curse. They had buried empty coffins once before in ignorance. Now they did it again in knowledge. The difference was unbearable. Years passed after the Collins case, but the silence of that farm would never leave the town of Bellerose. Time does what it can to erase memory, but the past, when left to fester, grows into something darker than forgotten. The graves behind the barn, empty though they were, remained. And in the quiet corners of the town, where mothers whispered and children trembled, the name Collins was spoken only in hushed breaths, for there was a new truth they could not escape. Evil, once masked, could live forever in silence. The law, in its cold and indifferent way, responded to the discovery with new rules. Laws born from terror, born from the knowledge that evil could live unnoticed and could hide in plain sight, behind a smile. In the wake of what they'd found beneath the Collins farmhouse, the state passed a law requiring all unmarked graves to be investigated, no matter how old, no matter how obscure. It was a meager response, an attempt to bind the broken earth of the farm with regulations, a way to promise that the town would no longer ignore the hollow faces of those who had disappeared. But those who had lost loved ones knew better. For them, it was too little, too late. The law would never bring back the travelers, the workers, the drifters, the names that had never been spoken aloud. It could never bring back the children who had vanished into the night, their small bodies bent and broken by a father who saw them as nothing more than subjects in an experiment. A few brave souls, relatives of those lost, whose faces were still haunted by the images of what they knew their loved ones had endured, demanded memorials, small reminders that the pain had not gone unrecognized. They requested markers, stones etched with the names of the dead, a simple acknowledgement of life extinguished. But the state resisted. Collins had disappeared. His body was never found. His crimes remained sealed behind the walls of the farmhouse, locked in the heavy silence that had followed his escape. No memorial was ever built in his name. No state acknowledgement came to pass. Instead, the story of his madness was tucked away in the dark corners of history. A warning unspoken but felt. Evil can remain silent. Evil can remain hidden. And sometimes the silence is the most terrifying thing of all. The neighbors of Bellerose grew older, and the farm itself passed into disrepair. The barn sagging under the weight of time, the house falling slowly back into the earth. Yet the town remained haunted, not by ghosts of the past, but by a truth that had taken root in their very bones. It was not just the knowledge that Collins had been evil, but the knowledge that no one had known. How could they have missed it? He had looked like any other man. He had smiled like any other father. He had sat in church, his hands folded as though his faith were as genuine as any other. And it was that fact, that he had been able to live beside them for so long, to exist unnoticed, that disturbed them more than anything. How could they have believed a man who took his family and made them his experiments, a man who committed horrors beyond reason, could look like anyone else? Evil, it seemed, wore the face of the normal. It walked among them, masked as something good, something kind. Collins had created his own church beneath the barn, a sanctuary of bone and blood, and though the town had come to realize this in fragmented pieces, they could not fully comprehend the depth of the sickness that had overtaken the man they thought they knew. What had driven him? Was it a twisted belief, a faith so broken it became a weapon? Was it his need to control, to measure, to shape the human body like clay? Or had something darker been at work within him, something no one could name, some evil that rose not from the actions of a man but from the land itself? This uncertainty remained, and it was passed down like an inheritance of fear and suspicion. Parents told their children the story of Collins in hushed tones, and each generation, though it tried to move on, carried with it the imprint of that farm, those graves, the unsettling realization that such evil had been allowed to go unnoticed for so long. And they asked themselves, could it happen again? Could another man like Collins rise from the dust wearing the same face, the same mask, and fool them all once more? The state may have closed the book on Thomas Collins, but the town of Bellerose could not. They never stopped wondering if another would come, another monster hidden behind the same face. They did not realize that such evil is not confined to a single body, to a single man. It is not bound by law or time. It is the whispering darkness, the hollow place in every heart where a mask can be worn, where silence can be cultivated, and where cruelty becomes a form of worship. As the years dragged on, some old wounds began to heal. The names of the lost faded from memory, the pain dulling as it so often does with time. But the fear, the understanding that evil could exist without warning, without explanation, lived on. There were no more wooden crosses behind the barn, but the land had not forgotten, and neither had the town. The story of Thomas Collins, like the hollow graves beneath the earth, remained, a warning whispered on the wind. Evil can live in silence. Evil can live in plain sight. And evil, when it wears the face of normalcy, is the most dangerous of all.